You think you know why Elizabeth I never married. Political strategy, right? Dedication to England? The whole Virgin Queen mystique? Well, buckle up, because the real reason is far more disturbing and brutally personal than any history textbook will ever tell you. Elizabeth didn't avoid marriage because she was married to England. She avoided it because she watched it destroy every single woman in her immediate family. One by one, systematically, horrifically. This wasn't some abstract political calculation. This was survival instinct born from witnessing a parade of marriage-related deaths, executions, and psychological destruction that would make a horror movie seem tame. Before we dive into the specific nightmare that was Elizabeth's childhood, let's understand the system she was trapped in. In 16th century England, marriage wasn't about love or partnership. It was a legal transaction where women ceased to exist as independent beings. The doctrine of coverture meant that when a woman married, her legal identity was completely absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or make any legal decisions without his permission. For a queen regnant, this created an impossible paradox. How do you rule a kingdom when the law says your husband legally controls you? Other European queens were grappling with this same problem. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's contemporary and cousin, would eventually lose everything through marriage. Catherine de' Medici in France maintained power only by outliving her husband and ruling through her sons. The message was crystal clear. Marriage and female power were fundamentally incompatible in the Tudor system. But here's what made Elizabeth's situation unique. Most queens had to learn these lessons through distant examples or political theory. Elizabeth got a front-row seat to the consequences of royal marriage through her own family. Starting when she was barely old enough to understand what was happening. Her father, Henry VIII, went through 6 wives like some kind of matrimonial serial experiment. 2 were executed. 2 were divorced after humiliating public trials. 1 died shortly after childbirth. Only 1 survived him, and even she didn't escape the marriage death trap for long. This wasn't just family drama Elizabeth heard about secondhand. She lived through it, witnessed it, survived it. Think about what it means to grow up watching your father systematically destroy women through the institution of marriage. Not strangers, not distant relatives, your own mother, your stepmothers, women who held you, taught you, lived in the same palaces. One day, they're queens of England, draped in jewels and surrounded by courtiers. The next, they're being dragged to execution blocks or dying in agony from childbirth complications. The Tudor court wasn't just a royal household. It was a laboratory of matrimonial horror, and Elizabeth was both observer and potential subject. Every wedding she witnessed came with an unspoken question. How will this one end? Execution? Childbirth death? Political destruction? Because in Elizabeth's experience, happy endings simply didn't exist for married queens. And the truly disturbing part, all of this was completely legal. Henry VIII didn't break any laws executing his wives. He used the legal system exactly as it was designed. When a queen's adultery threatened the royal succession, that was treason. Penalty: death. When a king decided his marriage was invalid, he had the religious and political power to make that happen, regardless of what his wife wanted. The system was rigged from the start, and Elizabeth had a front-row seat to watch it destroy the women closest to her. But let's get specific. Let's talk about the actual people whose deaths shaped Elizabeth's understanding of marriage. Because this wasn't abstract political theory. These were real women whose screams echoed through palace halls, real blood on Tower Green, real bodies that ceased breathing because they made the fatal mistake of becoming someone's wife, starting with the woman who gave her life, literally. Let's start with the most foundational trauma of Elizabeth's life. On May 19, 1536, Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded at the Tower of London. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. Before you think she was too young to be affected, understand this. The trauma wasn't just the execution, it was everything that followed. Anne Boleyn's story is one of the most documented marital catastrophes in English history. She wasn't some naive girl who stumbled into danger. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and fully aware of the game she was playing. Henry VIII had already divorced one wife to marry her. Anne knew the stakes. She thought she could win. She was spectacularly wrong. The marriage started with promise. Henry VIII broke from the Roman Catholic Church, risked war with European powers, and caused a constitutional crisis, all to marry Anne Boleyn. On September 7, 1533, she gave birth to Elizabeth. The problem? Henry wanted a son, desperately, obsessively, the kind of want that turns love into murderous rage when disappointed. Anne had multiple miscarriages after Elizabeth's birth. In January 1536, she miscarried a male child. That was essentially her death sentence, though it would take a few more months to execute. Henry decided he needed a new wife, but divorcing Anne would mean admitting his break from Rome had been for nothing. So instead, he destroyed her. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges? Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Incest, treason, high treason specifically, because a queen's adultery threatened the royal succession. The evidence was practically non-existent. Modern historians universally agree the charges were fabricated. But in Tudor England, evidence didn't matter when the king wanted you dead. Here's what actually happened in those final weeks. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, orchestrated an investigation that forced confessions through torture and intimidation. Men were arrested and interrogated. Some broke under pressure. Anne's musician, Mark Smeaton, was tortured until he confessed to adultery with the Queen. Other men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested on similarly absurd charges. On May 15, 1536, Anne was tried and convicted. The verdict was predetermined. 2 days later, the 5 men accused with her were executed. Anne herself was beheaded on May 19th. She was probably around 35 years old. Her supposed crimes? Almost certainly completely fabricated to give Henry legal cover for what was essentially murder by state execution. Now here's the part that haunted Elizabeth for the rest of her life. The day Anne Boleyn died, Elizabeth went from being Princess Elizabeth, heir to the throne, to being legally a bastard. The same act of Parliament that allowed Henry to execute Anne also declared Elizabeth illegitimate. Think about what that means for a small child. Your mother is executed for crimes that include sexual betrayal of your father. You are publicly declared a bastard. Your entire identity is destroyed overnight. Elizabeth was too young to attend the execution or fully understand what was happening. But she wasn't too young to feel the change. Overnight, her household was reduced. Her clothes, her attendance, her status, everything changed. The people around her whispered. Some probably blamed Anne, others blamed Henry. But everyone knew. Marriage to the king had killed her mother. And here's the truly disturbing detail that historians emphasize. Elizabeth grew up knowing that her very existence was the reason her mother died. Not because she personally did anything wrong, but because she was born female instead of male. Because she couldn't fulfill Henry VIII's desperate need for a male heir. In Henry's mind, Anne had failed. The penalty for that failure was death. This is the first lesson Elizabeth learned about marriage. When you marry a king, your value is determined entirely by your ability to produce the right kind of children. Fail at that, and the same man who moved heaven and earth to marry you will have you executed on fabricated charges. Love, political alliance, religious revolution. None of it protects you when you've outlived your usefulness. But Anne Boleyn's fate taught Elizabeth something even more disturbing. The legal system was designed to destroy wives. Henry didn't have to skulk around committing murder in dark alleys. He used courts, judges, and legal procedures. He had Anne tried by a jury of her peers, nobles who knew perfectly well they were participating in judicial murder, but couldn't refuse the king. The system worked exactly as designed, grinding Anne Boleyn into dust while maintaining a veneer of legality. Elizabeth would never forget this. When she became queen and Parliament pressured her to marry, she would reference her mother's fate obliquely in speeches. Historians analyzing her rhetoric find repeated patterns of resistance to male authority, fear of losing autonomy, and deep suspicion of marriage as an institution. All of it traceable back to this moment. To a 2-year-old girl whose mother's head was separated from her body because marriage to the wrong man meant death. But this was just the first case study in Elizabeth's education about the dangers of royal marriage. Anne Boleyn was lesson 1. There would be many more. And the next one. She was old enough to remember it clearly, old enough to understand exactly what was happening, old enough to be terrified that she might be next. Elizabeth was 8 years old when she learned that her mother's execution wasn't some unique tragedy. It was a pattern, a system, and it could happen again. Catherine Howard became Henry VIII's fifth wife on July 28, 1540. She was probably around 17 years old, maybe younger. Historians debate her exact birth year, but everyone agrees she was barely out of childhood. Henry VIII was 49, morbidly obese, and suffering from painful leg ulcers that oozed constantly. This wasn't a love match. This was an aging king desperate for youth and one more chance at a male heir, paired with a girl who had no power to refuse. For about a year, things seemed fine. Catherine was young, vivacious, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the perks of being queen. She had jewels, status, and the ability to help her family members. Henry, for his part, was infatuated. He called her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with gifts and attention. To 8-year-old Elizabeth, watching from the edges of court life, it might have seemed like evidence that royal marriage could work out after all. Then November 1541 happened, and Elizabeth learned that the system would destroy you even if you hadn't done what they accused you of. Here's what we know from historical records. Before marrying Henry, Catherine had been involved with at least 2 men. This wasn't unusual for young women in Tudor households, where supervision was loose and teenage hormones ran high. But for a queen, any sexual history before marriage was potentially treasonous because it threatened the legitimacy of any children she might have with the king. Someone informed on Catherine, probably for political reasons having nothing to do with morality. Henry's counsel presented him with evidence that his rose without a thorn had a sexual past. And possibly, though the evidence is much weaker, that she was having an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Henry VIII's reaction was pure rage mixed with humiliation. He had been made a fool, again. His young wife, the one who was supposed to restore his youth and virility, had betrayed him. Whether she actually committed adultery while married to him is historically unclear. What's absolutely clear is that her past was enough to destroy her. The investigation was brutal and public. Men were arrested and tortured. Thomas Culpeper was convicted of adultery with the Queen, though his confession may have been coerced. Francis Derham, one of Catherine's premarital lovers, was also arrested and convicted. Both men were executed in December 1541, but their deaths were just the opening act. Catherine herself was initially confined to her apartments while the investigation proceeded. Then she was stripped of her title and moved to Sion Abbey, essentially under house arrest. The charges were formally brought. She had concealed her sexual past from the king, which constituted treason because it threatened the succession, and possibly she had committed adultery during the marriage, which was definitely treason. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who got a trial before being executed, Catherine Howard didn't even get that courtesy. Parliament passed a bill of attainder against her, which meant she was condemned without trial. On February 10, 1542, this bill became law. 3 days later, on February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded at the Tower of London. She was probably around 19 years old. According to contemporary accounts, Catherine was so terrified on her final night that she asked for the execution block to be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head on it. Think about that. A teenage girl so paralyzed by fear that she spent her last hours rehearsing her own death. This is what happened to queens who displeased Henry VIII. Elizabeth was watching all of this unfold. She was living in the same royal household. She heard the rumors. She saw Catherine stripped of her title and removed from court. She knew when the execution date was set, and she understood with crystal clarity what this meant. It didn't matter if you were guilty or innocent. It didn't matter if you were young and charming and the king seemed to love you. If you were a queen and you failed to meet expectations, you died. But here's what made Catherine Howard's fate even more instructive for young Elizabeth. Catherine hadn't failed to produce an heir. She hadn't miscarried a male child like Anne Boleyn. She simply had a sexual past that became politically inconvenient. The bar for execution wasn't even as high as reproductive failure. It was merely existing in a way that didn't perfectly align with what the king needed at any given moment. The system Henry VIII used to destroy Catherine Howard was even more efficient than what he'd used on Anne Boleyn. No trial, no opportunity for defense, just a parliamentary bill and a swift execution. The legal machinery had been refined, optimized, made more deadly. And there was one more lesson embedded in Catherine Howard's destruction. Henry VIII didn't just execute Catherine, he also passed a law making it treason for any woman to marry the king without revealing her complete sexual history. Imagine being so petty, so vindictive that you change the entire legal system because your teenage wife wasn't a virgin. That's the level of control husbands had over wives. Even after death, Catherine's fate was being used to terrorize future women. For 8-year-old Elizabeth, the pattern was now undeniable. Her mother, executed. Her stepmother, executed. Both times, marriage to her father had been a death sentence. Both times, the law had been on Henry's side. Both times, the women had been powerless to protect themselves. But surely, Elizabeth might have thought, this couldn't keep happening forever. Eventually, there had to be a wife who survived, someone who figured out how to navigate the system, someone who proved that marriage to powerful men didn't have to end in blood. There was such a woman, Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife, the one who survived him. Elizabeth would come to know her well, live in her household, trust her even, and then watch that survival instinct fail catastrophically the moment Catherine Parr remarried. Catherine Parr must have seemed like proof that the system could be beaten. She married Henry VIII on July 12, 1543, when Elizabeth was nearly 10 years old. Unlike Henry's previous wives, Catherine was older, more experienced, and demonstrably intelligent. She'd already been married twice before, both times widowed. She knew how to manage powerful men. She was educated, religiously moderate, and politically savvy. For the first time in Elizabeth's life, she had a stepmother who actually took an interest in her. Catherine Parr brought Elizabeth back to court, supervised her education, and treated her with genuine affection. Elizabeth studied Latin, Greek, French, and Italian under Catherine's patronage. For a few years, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, marriage didn't have to destroy women. Catherine had figured out how to survive Henry VIII. She'd even managed to influence his religious policies and maintain her own intellectual life. Then Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547. Catherine Parr had done it. She'd survived marriage to the most dangerous man in England. She was only 34 years old, wealthy, and free. She could have retired to her estates, lived comfortably, and died of old age in her bed. Elizabeth, now 13, must have felt relief. Finally, a stepmother who wasn't going to end up executed or destroyed. Catherine Parr lasted exactly 4 months before remarrying, and that's when everything went catastrophically wrong. The man Catherine married was Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. He was ambitious, charming, and completely inappropriate. The marriage was scandalously fast. They wed sometime in May 1547, barely 4 months after Henry's death. By Tudor standards, this was almost obscenely quick. Queens Dowager were expected to mourn for at least a year before remarrying. Catherine couldn't even wait half that time. Why the rush? Historians speculate that Catherine and Thomas had been in love before she married Henry VIII. Maybe this was her chance at real romance after 3 political marriages. Maybe she was 34 and desperate for children. Maybe she was just tired of being controlled by political necessity and wanted to make one choice for herself. Whatever her reasons, it was a disaster from the start, and Elizabeth, now living in Catherine and Thomas's household, got to witness the whole thing firsthand. Here's where the documented historical record gets deeply uncomfortable. Thomas Seymour began behaving inappropriately with 14-year-old Elizabeth. We know this because multiple servants reported it, and later, during Seymour's trial for treason, Elizabeth herself was interrogated about it. The incident started relatively minor. Seymour would come into Elizabeth's bedroom in the mornings while she was still in bed, sometimes in his nightclothes. He'd make jokes, tickle her, slap her bottom playfully. Catherine Parr was sometimes present during these encounters and seemed to treat them as harmless fun. At one point, Catherine even helped Thomas cut Elizabeth's dress to ribbons while Elizabeth was wearing it, all supposedly in jest. But the encounters escalated. There are reports of Seymour trying to kiss Elizabeth, of him being found alone in her bedroom, of Elizabeth barricading herself in her rooms to avoid him. The servants were disturbed enough to gossip about it. Catherine Parr eventually realized this wasn't harmless and sent Elizabeth away from the household in May 1548, barely a year after Elizabeth had come to live with them. Historians debate exactly how to characterize Seymour's behavior. Was it grooming, sexual harassment, attempted seduction of a teenager under his guardianship? Whatever you call it, it was clearly inappropriate and deeply disturbing to Elizabeth. This was the man her beloved stepmother had married, the man Catherine had chosen freely, after surviving Henry VIII. But the nightmare wasn't over for Catherine Parr. She was pregnant. At age 35 in Tudor England, this was dangerous. She'd never had children before, which meant her body was unprepared for the ordeal. And she was giving birth in an era where childbed fever, hemorrhaging, and countless other complications killed women regularly. On August 30th, 1548, Catherine Parr gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour. For a few days she seemed to be recovering. Then the fever set in. Puerperal fever, called childbed fever in the period. A bacterial infection that entered through tears in the birth canal and spread through her body. In an era before antibiotics, it was a death sentence. Catherine Parr died on September 5th, 1548, just 6 days after giving birth. She was 36 years old. The woman who had survived Henry VIII, who had been kind to Elizabeth, who had seemed to prove that intelligent, careful women could navigate the marriage system safely, died anyway. Not from political intrigue, not from execution, from the simple biological reality of pregnancy and childbirth in the 16th century. Elizabeth was 15 years old when Catherine died, old enough to understand exactly what had happened. Catherine had escaped the execution block. She'd outlived the most dangerous husband imaginable. She'd remarried for love, or at least for personal choice. And she still died because of that marriage. Died giving birth to a child conceived in her supposedly happy second marriage. Died while married to a man who had sexually harassed her stepdaughter. The lesson was inescapable. Marriage killed women, even when they weren't executed, even when they married for love, even when they were intelligent and experienced and thought they knew what they were doing. The system was designed to destroy them one way or another. But the horror didn't end with Catherine's death. Thomas Seymour, now widowed, immediately started plotting to marry Elizabeth. She was 15. He was around 40. He'd been sexually inappropriate with her while married to her stepmother. And now, with Catherine barely cold in her grave, he was trying to arrange a marriage that would make him stepfather to the heir to the throne. Elizabeth refused, adamantly. Her servants reported that she wanted nothing to do with him. But Seymour didn't give up easily. He continued his schemes, trying to build a power base, attempting to kidnap the young King Edward VI, Elizabeth's half-brother. Eventually, his plots were discovered. Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason and executed on March 20th, 1549. During the investigation, Elizabeth was interrogated extensively. At 15 years old, She had to answer detailed questions about whether Seymour had touched her inappropriately, whether she'd encouraged him, whether she'd agreed to marry him secretly. The interrogation was designed to trap her, to find any evidence that she'd participated in Seymour's treason. One wrong answer could have meant her own execution. Elizabeth navigated the interrogation brilliantly, denying everything that could be used against her while admitting just enough to seem honest. She survived. But the experience taught her that even being connected to the wrong man, even as a victim of his inappropriate behavior, could get you killed. Think about what Elizabeth had witnessed by age 15. Her stepmother, Catherine Parr, had married for love, gotten pregnant, and died in agony from childbed fever. The man Catherine had loved turned out to be a predator who sexually harassed Elizabeth and then tried to marry her by force for political power. When that scheme failed, he was executed for treason. And Elizabeth herself had been interrogated as a potential accomplice simply because she'd been in the wrong household at the wrong time. This was the reality of marriage for women connected to power. Even the smart ones died. Even the survivors eventually fell. Even choosing your own husband didn't protect you from death, betrayal, or political destruction. But Elizabeth still had one more case study to observe. One more woman whose marriage would demonstrate the ultimate horror. What happened when a queen regnant, not just a queen consort, tried to marry? Her older half-sister Mary was about to take the throne, and her disastrous marriage would provide the final, definitive proof that queens and marriage were fundamentally incompatible. When Mary I became queen in 1553, Elizabeth was 20 years old. Old enough to understand politics. Old enough to watch very carefully what happened when a woman held absolute power and then chose to marry. What Elizabeth witnessed over the next 5 years would cement every lesson she'd learned from childhood into an unbreakable rule. Queens who marry lose everything. Mary, I had every reason to be desperate for marriage and children. She was 37 years old when she became queen, ancient by Tudor childbearing standards. She'd spent most of her adult life declared illegitimate, excluded from succession, watching her father marry and discard wives, including her own mother, Catherine of Aragon. She'd been separated from her mother, forbidden to see her as Catherine died alone and possibly poisoned. Mary's entire life had been shaped by Henry VIII's marital disasters. But Mary drew the opposite conclusion from Elizabeth. Where Elizabeth saw marriage as a death trap, Mary saw it as salvation. She needed a husband to help her rule. She needed children to secure the Catholic succession she was desperate to establish. She needed, in her own mind, a man to make her complete. The Tudor system had taught her that women weren't meant to rule alone. So Mary started looking for a husband, and she made the single worst choice possible: Philip II of Spain. The marriage negotiations began almost immediately after Mary took the throne. Philip was the son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was one of the most powerful men in Europe. He was also 11 years younger than Mary, Catholic to his core, and had absolutely no interest in Mary as a person. This was purely a political marriage designed to bind England to Spanish interests. The English people hated the idea. Parliament petitioned Mary not to marry Philip. They understood what Elizabeth instinctively knew. A foreign king consort would control England's foreign policy, drain its resources, and potentially drag the country into Spain's wars. But Mary was adamant. She needed this marriage. She wanted children. She wanted a Catholic dynasty. She convinced herself that Philip would love her, help her, be a true partner. They married on July 25, 1554, at Winchester Cathedral. Mary wore a dress embroidered with gold, determined to look young and attractive for her new husband. Philip, by all accounts, was polite but emotionally distant. He'd seen portraits of Mary. He knew she was significantly older than him. He was doing his dynastic duty, nothing more. The marriage contract tried to protect English interests. Philip was given the title of king, but was explicitly denied real power. He couldn't inherit the throne if Mary died. He couldn't appoint foreigners to English offices without parliamentary consent. On paper, England's sovereignty was protected. In practice, none of that mattered. Because Mary was in love, or at least desperately wanted to be, and she gave Philip everything he wanted. Philip immediately began influencing English foreign policy. He pushed Mary toward war with France to support Spanish interests. He brought Spanish advisors into the English court. He spent English money on Spanish problems. Parliament resisted, but Mary overruled them repeatedly because she wanted to please her husband. The Queen, who should have had absolute power, was functionally controlled by her husband's political agenda. But the political disaster was nothing compared to the personal tragedy that followed, because Mary was determined to get pregnant. Within months of the marriage, Mary announced she was pregnant. The whole country celebrated. This was what everyone had been waiting for, a Catholic heir who would secure the succession and prove that Mary's marriage had been worthwhile. Mary's belly swelled. She went into confinement in March 1555, preparing for the birth. Nobles gathered. Announcements were prepared. The whole country waited for news of the royal birth. And waited. And waited. By May 1555, it was becoming obvious that something was wrong. Mary's belly wasn't getting bigger. There were no labor pains. No baby appeared. Eventually, quietly, the court had to admit the truth. Mary wasn't pregnant. She'd never been pregnant. What everyone had thought was a baby was probably a tumor, possibly ovarian cancer, or simply the desperate delusion of a woman whose entire self-worth had become tied to producing an heir. The phantom pregnancy of 1555 is one of the most documented medical oddities in Tudor history. Multiple ambassadors wrote about it. Court records mention it. Mary herself genuinely believed she was pregnant for months. She felt movement. Her belly distended. But there was no baby. Just a 39-year-old woman's body betraying her desperate need to fulfill the only role Tudor society valued women for: childbearing. Philip left England shortly after it became clear there was no baby. He had no reason to stay. Mary wasn't pregnant. She couldn't give him an heir. He had other political problems to deal with in Europe. He left his wife behind, heartbroken and humiliated, still Queen of England but completely powerless to keep her husband by her side. Elizabeth watched all of this from a position of extreme danger. Mary suspected Elizabeth of plotting against her. In March 1554, Elizabeth had been imprisoned in the Tower of London for 2 months, suspected of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion against Mary's Spanish marriage. Elizabeth had narrowly avoided execution. She knew that Mary saw her as a threat, and that her Protestant faith made her even more dangerous in Mary's eyes. But Elizabeth also watched what marriage had done to Mary. The powerful queen who'd taken the throne against all odds had become a woman begging her husband not to leave. The ruler of England had allowed Spanish interests to override English welfare. The woman who should have been able to command armies couldn't even command her husband's presence in her own country. Mary had a possible second phantom pregnancy in 1557, 1558. Again, she convinced herself she was carrying a child. Again, her body swelled. Again, there was no baby. This time, Philip didn't even bother returning to England to pretend interest. Mary was dying, probably from ovarian cancer, and she spent her final months desperately hoping for a pregnancy that would never come and a husband who would never return. Mary died on November 17, 1558, at the age of 42. She died without children. She died knowing her Protestant half-sister would inherit the throne and undo all her Catholic reforms. She died having accomplished nothing she'd set out to do. And she died having sacrificed her political autonomy, her country's welfare, and her personal dignity, all for a marriage that brought her nothing but pain. Elizabeth, now 25 years old, became queen that same day. And she'd just received the final devastating lesson about royal marriage. Mary had been queen regnant, not just queen consort. She'd held real power. And marriage had destroyed that power completely. Not through execution or childbirth death, but through something even worse: willing submission to a man who didn't love her, didn't respect her, and used her country's resources for his own ends. This was the pattern Elizabeth had witnessed her entire life. Anne Boleyn, executed because she failed to produce a male heir. Catherine Howard, executed because her past was inconvenient. Catherine Parr, died in childbirth after remarrying. Mary the Ray, politically destroyed and emotionally devastated by marriage. Every single woman in Elizabeth's immediate family who had married had been destroyed by it. Not one had found happiness, safety, or lasting power through marriage. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Marriage was meant to transfer power from women to men. For common women, this meant losing property rights and legal autonomy. For queens, it meant losing the throne itself, or at least any real control over it. The law was clear. Husbands controlled wives, even if the wife was Queen of England. Elizabeth understood this with crystal clarity. When Parliament started pressuring her to marry within months of her coronation, she already knew her answer. She'd spent 25 years watching marriage destroy women. She wasn't going to let it destroy her. But saying no to marriage when you were Queen of England wasn't simple. Parliament wanted heirs. Foreign powers wanted alliances. Her own council wanted a king to help her rule, because they couldn't imagine a woman managing alone. The pressure would be constant, intense, and unrelenting for decades. Elizabeth's response would be one of the most brilliant political strategies in history, and it would come at a personal cost that most people never consider. When Elizabeth took the throne on November 17, 1558, she was 25 years old and had already survived more assassination attempts, political plots, and family trauma than most people experienced in a lifetime. She'd been declared illegitimate, imprisoned in the Tower, interrogated for treason, and watched every married woman in her immediate family either executed or destroyed. Now she was queen, and everyone expected her to marry immediately. The pressure started within months. Parliament petitioned her to choose a husband. Foreign ambassadors dangled their princes and archdukes like bait. Her own council, led by William Cecil, urged her to secure the succession through marriage. The message was clear. You're just a woman. You need a man to help you rule. You need to produce heirs. You need to do what queens are supposed to do. Elizabeth's response was revolutionary. She told Parliament she was already married, to England. She said she would be happy to die a virgin and have it inscribed on her tomb that she had lived and died a maiden queen. She wore coronation rings and referred to them as her wedding bands. She created an entire iconography around her virginity, turning what should have been a liability into a source of power. But this wasn't just clever branding. This was survival strategy born from trauma. Elizabeth had learned that marriage meant death or submission. She'd seen her mother beheaded, her stepmothers destroyed, her sister humiliated. She understood something that Parliament refused to accept. A married queen regnant was a contradiction in terms. The law said husbands controlled wives. If she married, she'd lose the power she'd just gained. So she didn't marry. But she also didn't say no, definitively. Instead, Elizabeth invented a brilliant strategy. She kept everyone hoping. For 45 years, she entertained marriage proposals, negotiated terms, allowed courtiers to believe they might win her hand. She used the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic weapon, dangling it in front of foreign powers to manipulate alliances and prevent wars. The list of her suitors reads like a who's who of European nobility. Philip II of Spain, her late sister's husband, proposed within months of Mary's death. Elizabeth negotiated with him for over a year before politely declining. Archduke Charles of Austria was a serious candidate for years in the 1560s. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the man she possibly actually loved, remained a constant presence in her life, but never became her husband. Francis, Duke of Anjou, a French prince 20 years her junior, was her last serious suitor when she was in her late 40s. Over 45 years of reign, Elizabeth received over 70 documented marriage proposals. She said no to every single one, but she said it slowly, carefully, in ways that kept her options open and her suitors hoping. It was a high-wire act of political manipulation that required constant attention and incredible skill. The cost of this strategy was enormous. Elizabeth had no children. She had no direct heirs. This meant England faced potential succession crises throughout her entire reign. Who would inherit if she died unexpectedly? Would there be civil war? Would foreign powers invade? These were real threats that kept her council awake at night. The pressure on Elizabeth to marry was unrelenting. In 1562, she nearly died from smallpox. When she recovered, with her face scarred and her mortality suddenly very real, Parliament renewed their demands that she marry and produce an heir. She refused. In 1566, Parliament literally threatened to withhold funding until she agreed to marry. She dissolved Parliament rather than give in. Her council tried everything. They argued national security. They warned of succession crises. They implied she was being selfish, that her duty to England required marriage and childbirth. William Cecil, her most trusted advisor, spent decades trying to convince her to marry. She refused him too. The personal cost was incalculable. Elizabeth was likely lonely. She formed intense emotional attachments to favorites at court, most notably Robert Dudley, whom she possibly loved for decades. But she never married him. When Dudley married someone else in 1578, Elizabeth was reportedly devastated. She'd given up romantic love to keep her power. There's also the question of whether Elizabeth was physically capable of having children. Some historians speculate she had medical issues that would have made pregnancy difficult or impossible. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that she watched her sister Mary go through 2 phantom pregnancies, watched countless women die in childbirth, and knew that pregnancy after age 30 was extremely dangerous in Tudor England. Even if she'd wanted children, the risk might have been too high. But the deepest cost was psychological. Elizabeth spent her entire adult life performing a role. The Virgin Queen, married to England, untouchable and unchangeable. She couldn't show weakness. She couldn't admit loneliness. She couldn't even acknowledge that her choice might have personal costs. Because the moment she showed vulnerability about marriage, Parliament would pounce and try to force her into it. Robert Dudley died in 1588, when Elizabeth was 55. By all accounts, she was genuinely devastated. She locked herself in her rooms for days. She kept his last letter to her in a box by her bedside for the rest of her life. This was the man she might have married if the world had been different, if she hadn't been queen, if marriage hadn't meant losing everything she'd fought for. Elizabeth reigned for 45 years. She defeated the Spanish Armada. She presided over a golden age of English culture. She established England as a major European power. She accomplished all of this as a single woman in a world that insisted women needed husbands to function. But she also died alone. On March 24, 1603, at age 69, Elizabeth the Fine died at Richmond Palace. She'd outlived most of her generation. She had no children, no direct heirs. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, her executed cousin. The Tudor dynasty ended with her death. History remembers Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, one of England's greatest monarchs. What history often forgets is the price she paid. She sacrificed romantic love, family, and the comfort of companionship. She endured decades of pressure, criticism, and questioning of her choices. She lived with the constant threat of assassination from people who thought a married queen would be easier to control. All because she'd witnessed what this document has detailed, a systematic destruction of every married woman in her family. She'd watched her mother executed for failing to produce a son. She'd seen her stepmother executed for having a sexual past. She'd witnessed another stepmother die in childbirth after remarrying. She'd observed her sister humiliated and politically destroyed by marriage to a man who didn't love her. Elizabeth didn't avoid marriage because she was cold or calculating or unnaturally ambitious. She avoided it because she understood something that took the rest of Europe centuries to accept. In the legal and political system of the 16th century, marriage and female power were fundamentally incompatible. She could be a wife, or she could be a queen, not both. The disturbing reality that's been hidden in plain sight for 400 years isn't some secret document or shocking revelation. It's the pattern itself. Elizabeth I's refusal to marry wasn't a quirk of personality or a clever political strategy divorced from personal feeling. It was a rational response to watching marriage function as a death sentence for powerful women throughout her entire childhood and young adulthood. Every history class teaches that Elizabeth never married. What they don't teach is why. They don't connect the dots between Anne Boleyn's execution when Elizabeth was 2, Catherine Howard's beheading when she was 8, Catherine Parr's death in childbirth when she was 15, and Mary Weir's political destruction through marriage when she was 25. They don't explain that Elizabeth's choice was born from trauma, observation, and a cold-eyed assessment of how the system destroyed women who dared to marry while holding power. The Virgin Queen wasn't a mystical figure above human desires. She was a survivor who learned from watching her family die. She chose power and loneliness over marriage and death. And that choice, terrifying and lonely as it must have been, allowed her to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. The lesson Elizabeth learned, the one that shaped her entire reign, was simple and brutal. In Tudor England, queens who married lost everything. So she didn't marry. She ruled alone. She died alone. But she died as queen, with power intact, never having submitted to the system that had destroyed every other woman in her family. That's the disturbing reality behind the Virgin Queen. Not a romantic ideal, not a political calculation divorced from feeling, but a survival strategy born from witnessing systematic destruction of women through the institution of marriage. Elizabeth I looked at the system, understood how it worked, and refused to let it destroy her too. She won, but the victory cost everything she might have had as a woman who wasn't a queen. And that cost, hidden in the triumphant history of her reign, is the real tragedy that history classes conveniently forget to mention.